to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance here at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This is the School of Public Affairs for the university. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second annual Nakasaka Dialogues. This is a lecture series that stimulates conversations about the state of public life in America and encourages progress towards our shared bonds. The event and series were established through this generous support of Kiyoshi Nagasaka, who is with us today. Thank you so much, Kiyoshi. In the spirit of dialogue and conversation, we encourage you to participate in today's conversations by submitting questions. Those of you here, we're going to be passing out cards. Give us good questions. We're going to get to as many as possible. Those of you joining us online, and I know there are many of you there, you'll see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Give us questions there. If you are joining us online, you'll see there's also a closed caption option. And if you'd like to use that, just click on it and you'll have that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this afternoon's program, former U.S. Senator Rob Portman. Thank you so much for joining us. Senator Portman served in Ohio in the U.S. Senate from 2011 to 2023. Prior to that, he served 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives and was a cabinet member in 2 different positions under George W. Bush. While he was in Congress, he sponsored over 220 bills in a bipartisan manner, and became known as really one of the people who can meet in the middle with Democrats. And one sign of this is that the laws that he passed were signed by Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden. So that seems like a pretty good endorsement. Yeah, it does seem kind of impossible. Let's start with kind of a general question. It's really striking. You look back in American history, we've had a pattern of the important legislation being passed in a bipartisan manner. Medicare, one of the main sponsors was Jacob Javits, Republican from New York. Ronald Reagan's tax cuts, which a lot of people think of as, conservative landmark piece of legislation, they were really made possible by a very powerful Democrat from the blue state of Illinois, Dan Romsakowski in the House, who helped President Reagan lower the marginal tax rate from 70% to 50% and ultimately to 28%. It was really an historic bipartisan bill and set of efforts. What is it about America where we seem at our best to look to bipartisanship?
Well, first, Larry, thank you for having me. It was good to be back, and I look forward to meeting with some students later as well. And thanks for your leadership. I told Larry we have the Portman Center for Policy Solutions now at the University of Cincinnati, and we are looking at the Humphrey Center as kind of the model. We're a long way away with 2 staff and real estate that would fit in the corner of this room. So thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for your sponsorship. New issue. Thank you very much. I've got also 2 law school classmates here who are not permitted to ask questions. This is very scary. But so Sarah Mulligan, Nancy Arneson, and as you mentioned earlier, we were talking. I'm fortunate to have my sister Jenna here and her family, including her husband Alan and her daughter Mary, and her friend Brendan. And then my wife, Jane Portman, came all this way mostly because she wanted to hang out with my family, not me, but it's all right. Well, look, yeah, the best of America is when we work together to solve problems, and those large votes you talked about, Medicare as an example, is a 2/3 vote of House and Senate members, Republican and Democrat, makes it sustainable, right? It makes it life predictable. It enables us to not just pass legislation every 2 years as you change uh, with the cycles of elections, but to keep something in place for the long haul. And that's incredibly important. Tax policy is a good example of this. If every 2 years we had a different tax policy, it'd be terrible for the economy and very difficult for all of us as citizens to comply. And so that's one of the concerns I have right now when we started this center in Cincinnati is I see that our system over the 30 years I've been involved with it is becoming more difficult to maneuver in terms of finding common ground. So I think there's sort of an ideological split, which is understandable, and spirited discussion is a good thing. We're a country that prides itself on people's right to express themselves and to debate vigorously. But at the end of the day, we also have traditionally figured out how to come together and find that common ground. Not always. We had a civil war in this country. We've had plenty of disagreeable moments coming out of the Depression, certainly, and even more recently with the Great Recession and different ideas. But ultimately, just as you do in your family and in your businesses and here at the university, you've got to figure out how to move forward. And that's where I worry, is that there are increasing incentives not to do that. And these incentives come from all different points of political life. But one is fundraising. Fundraisers used to primarily raise their money from individuals face to face. And you can say what you like about more major donor fundraising, people that give, say, $500 or $1,000. But a lot of those people tended not to have a particular issue or point of view, tended not to be as partisan. Whereas today, what's the way most people raise most of their money? It's online. It's in $30, $40, $50, $60 increments again and again. And I remember when I was thinking of running for reelection, my consultants all came to me, Larry, and said, your emails are really terrible. Like, they are bad. No wonder you can't raise any money online. And we were raising some, but what they said was, you've got to be on the attack. You've got to put out the red meat. That's how you raise money online. And you get these emails, you know what I'm talking about. It's like the world's coming to an end unless you give me $15. And so people are literally raising tens of millions of dollars in a quarter through these online attack emails. And, it works for them. And when you go to Congress, having been elected in that way, and you meet Mitch McConnell or you meet Chuck Schumer, they're unlikely to really have a lot of interest in working with you after you've called them the devil incarnate, whichever side you're on, And that's a difference. And I think that has driven us a little bit out to the periphery in terms of politics, more left, more right, rather than, more providing an incentive for people to get something done. I mean, most of my constituents, I think, still back in Ohio, and I think here in Minnesota is true too, they do expect members of Congress to get things done. But the people that respond to these emails, they'll be disappointed in you if you do that. They expect you to be more partisan. And so that's a difference. And then the primary systems, we'll talk about that later, Larry, I know, and you've got some strong views on that, I know, as a political scientist. But our primary system is getting more and more narrow. So you have fewer and fewer people electing our representatives. States are more red, states are more blue, districts are more red, districts are more blue. People say it's gerrymandering. Part of it's that. Part of it is, if you go to rural Minnesota, it's pretty darn red. And if you're here, it's pretty darn blue. And that's a divide that has grown and grown. The rural-urban divide, the people with college degrees and without college degree divide, the educational divide. So this is leading to a situation where with fewer people voting in primaries, but those who do vote being pretty intense on the left, pretty intense on the right, people getting elected who aren't representative of the entire state in terms of the Senate or the district in terms of the Congress. And that's driven people apart too. It makes it difficult to then come together with a 2/3 vote for Medicare, let's say, or even border legislation, which to me is the poster child of this, how could it be possible not to find some consensus on the disaster that's happening at the border? Nobody believes that the status quo is acceptable. And about 75 to 80% of people agree generally what we ought to do. And yet they can't even find a common ground there. So anyway, I think, Larry, it's a great American tradition. It has to continue for us to be prosperous and, you know, in terms of national defense, a country that continues to lead, that is this beacon of hope and opportunity for the rest of the world. We got to figure out how to get our act together. And that's the great challenge we have.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. You look at, let's say, Britain, which has a parliamentary system. They do party line voting all the time. It's highly unusual to have bipartisanship. It's, you know, the Conservative Party or the Labour Party with its platform. The Prime Minister's party, you know, so-called lays the bill down. And then it's a party line vote. And almost all the time, it's predictable exactly what will happen. That's not happened here. And I'm curious, when you look back in American history, whether it's today or back to Medicare, because Medicare floundered for a dozen years before it passed. Do you think James Madison had something to do with how difficult it is in America to get the majorities that we need?
Well, I think the founders, including Madison, had it right in the sense that they believed that they should provide incentives to find supermajorities. And therefore, you know, the famous story about Washington and Jefferson, which I'm sure is apocryphal, where he has a cup of tea and a saucer, and he says to Jefferson, you know, the tea, at that time, people would take their tea and they'd pour it in the saucer to cool it, right? Seems kind of weird, but they would do that. He said, that's what the Senate is. You know, you should have a body, the People's House, that is strictly majoritarian, where it's pretty much party line, let's face it, with few exceptions, as we saw this week. And thank goodness that aid package was a bipartisan effort. But that the Senate was the place to cool the passions. And there would be a supermajority. And this is the whole discussion about the filibuster, a 60-vote margin, which Republicans have not had a 60-vote margin forever. Democrats have had only on very limited occasions, including briefly while President Obama was in office. So I think that's purposeful. And I think, again, it's important to have that kind of bipartisan and, you know, larger than a majority vote for something to be able to encourage that sustainability we talked about earlier and predictability. And without that, I got to tell you, I really worry what would happen, not just in the Senate, but in the House. Because in the House, when you're trying to get something done on a bipartisan basis and get something actually accomplished, it's more challenging than the Senate often, because it is a majoritarian system and the Rules Committee is slanted toward whatever party is in power. They have a supermajority in the Rules Committee, as Republicans do now. I think it's a 2-to-1 majority, even though they have a 2-vote margin, and Democrats have done the same thing. But if you want to get something done, you do make the argument, as I did a lot when I was in the House for 12 years, of, you know, this is great. You want to change the bill so that it's more conservative, but if you do that, it'll never get through the Senate. The only way we can get it through the Senate with a 60-vote margin is to make some of these concessions now and work with the Senate. And so it doesn't just affect the Senate. It affects our whole system of government. And if anything, you know, I think, and I know this is a controversial issue, and right now, you know, most Democrats are against the filibuster, want to get rid of it. Most Republicans are for it. It goes back and forth. But it seems to me that that's one where, from an institutional point of view, we need to hold the line, or we will fall into even more of a partisan effort. The Senate becomes like the House, and we are hopelessly stuck in terms of solving issues like debt and deficit, like healthcare, like a tax system, like the border.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And I also think it's the case that it's because of the checks and balance system that you don't get anything done unless you have bipartisanship. Bipartisanship is the door that leads you through the sticky wickets that Madison and his colleagues set up, you know, way back 250 years ago. There is an argument that if we had more of a party line vote, yeah, some of the laws would be pretty scary. But if we didn't have the Madisonian system, if we had a parliamentary system in terms of party line voting that could overcome the filibuster in the Senate, then it would be clear to voters who's responsible. And so then accountability would be, more readily available. This is what the Democrats stood for. They wanted to, pass Obamacare. They wanted to impose these taxes, these regulations. If you don't like it, vote them out the next election. And similarly on immigration, I mean, right now it's kind of a dog's breakfast about who to blame. And we are hearing President Biden blaming Republicans, and the Republicans are going to blame President Biden, and it goes back and forth. And part of that is just in our system, it's so convoluted. It's difficult to tell who's responsible.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with you on that. And the examples you use, I mean, if you look at the data, the polling data, President Biden is getting blamed for what's going on the border. And frankly, the policies he changed when he got in are part of the reason we're in the mess we're in. So I don't think people are fooled too much by the political back and forth on this. I think they kind of have made their mind up. But I see what you're saying. I don't think it's worth jerking back and forth every couple of years. I mean, the majority of the Senate may well shift this year. The majority in the House may well shift this year. I mean, I think most odds makers would say that's more likely than not that those two things will happen. So you'd have this shift every 2 years. Presidential level, who knows what's going to happen? I did see your quotes this morning in the Minneapolis Star about how Minnesota is now a swing state. Ohio is not a swing state anymore, really. We're more reddish. But the point is shifting back and forth dramatically with election majorities and cycles, I think is very, very unhealthy. And as I said earlier, it's more to the point, perhaps, just getting anything done is very difficult if you don't have this attitude of reaching out across the aisle to get something done.
So I want to talk about the attitude. I noticed recently that Ted Cruz, who's running for re-election, if I were placing odds, I would say he's going to get reelected, but it looks like it's going to be a competitive election in Texas, meaning it'll be around 5 points that he wins by, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But his campaign committee is now advertising Ted Cruz as a deal maker, as a Rob Portman bipartisan guy, and they've got all this language about Ted Cruz coming to the middle. And, the polls show 85% of Americans or so support bipartisanship. And I'm not going to ask you to comment on your former colleague, but I think everyone in the room who follows politics is doubtful that Ted Cruz is a leader in bipartisanship. But it does raise the question, what does it take to be a bipartisan leader? You mentioned attitude. Ted Cruz doesn't strike me as having the temperament of a guy who listens and comes to the middle. You're not jumping in the way in, which is fine. What else would you say you look for? If you want to be a bipartisan leader, what does it look like? You got people here, you got students, you got folks online. They want to know, how can I be Rob Portman?
Well, God forbid. Yeah, I mean, I have not seen Ted's advertisements, but I will say that that's encouraging to me if his campaign thinks that's a good message, because maybe that means that more members are going to think this is, again, that the incentives are lining up to actually to do that. I see just the opposite. I see members running in red states and blue states, far to the right, far to the left. You're right, Ted did have a competitive race last time, and people view this race as being somewhat competitive. I tend to agree with you in terms of how it's going to end up, but I mean, I think that's a positive sign. And by the way, it is where most people are. So, in a state like Minnesota, as an example, again, assuming the numbers you were talking about this morning in the paper are correct, which is that it's more of a swing state, there should be an incentive for your statewide officials to reach out on the right or on the left, to reach out and get something done. My concern is I see, even among members who, are not MAGA or are not progressives, the sense of, why should I reach out? Because I don't get any incentive or a reward for finding that common ground. The way the fundraising happens, the way the primaries work, and frankly, the way the media operates. Since you're a professor, not a media person, I can complain about the media and you can't get mad at me. Bring it on. But my God, you know, when was the last time you saw a good policy discussion, you know, on a cable show? I mean, it's all controversy. I mean, they thrive on controversy. And again, I don't think it's where most Americans are, but they've got their niche, they've got their market. So MSNBC and Fox, you watch them, it's like two different worlds. And that's the problem in my view. So I give you one quick example. So you all remember when there was no Speaker of the House for several weeks. And so no legislation could get passed, and the rest of the world is looking on us and saying, you know, is America going to continue to have a democracy and be able to lead? That came because the chair, the speakership was vacated by a vote. One person was able to raise it, which was a rule that Kevin McCarthy put in place that I'm sure he regretted. And then that person was joined by 7 others, as I recall. 8 Republicans got rid of the Speaker of the House. That's about, as I recall, doing the math at the time, 3.9% of the Republican caucus. 3.9%, that's it. What? They raised more money. They actually were raising money while they were doing this, it turned out, as people looked back and said, well, they were on the floor, you know, raising money. And it worked for them. They raised a lot of money, probably more than some of them had ever raised in any short period of time. They were on all the Sunday shows. So for the first time ever, these members who were, you know, more obscure members were on Meet the Press and Face the Nation and CNN's Sunday show. And I mean, it was This Week with whoever. So, I mean, it was pretty good for them. What was the negative? They didn't lose their committee assignments. They didn't get punished. They got more money. They got more press attention. Back home, because they're in red districts, they were lauded. And if they had a primary opponent, that primary opponent probably dropped out because they looked like they were cornering the ideological right in their case. So that's what I worry about more, is that those members now don't really see an incentive to figuring out how to come to the middle, one, keep a speaker in place, and then try to work through issues. So I was delighted to see late last week, that the House came together and passed this aid package. As you know, Ukraine is one of the issues I feel so passionately about, but it was more to me just about getting something done. So encouraged to hear what's, you know, you say in terms of the advertising, but I think the issue really is, how do you bring people? And by the way, you can be MAGA, you can be very conservative, you can be progressive, very liberal, and still have an attitude that your job is to figure out how to get something done and find that common ground. You want to push it as part of the right or as part of the left as you can, that's fine. You want to have a vigorous and spirited debate, that's fine, that's good. But at the end of the day, how do you actually accomplish something that helps the people you represent? And as you know, we went through this with the infrastructure bill. There have been 5 administrations talking about it, many Congresses, and finally we said, we're going to figure this out. And we just had this attitude of, you know, none of us are going to love this bill, every part of it. It won't be perfect, but it will move our country forward. And I think that's what I see missing.
You mentioned incentives, and clearly the primary elections are part of that, maybe the part of it. Before the 1970s, it was state and local parties that would nominate candidates, and you know, there's no reason to romanticize this. In the South, it meant that only whites were being nominated in some parties in some parts of the South. And it really wasn't until you get into the 70s where you've got, in my view, some opportunistic behavior on the part of some liberal Democrats to win the presidential nomination. It leads to the beginning of this transformation. The transformation is from party leaders who are concerned about winning the general election to the more ideologically oriented activists who are concerned about their agendas. And you put it just perfectly. It's, you know, it's my issue, even if the legislation doesn't pass. I'm gonna, you know, die on this rock fighting for my issue. And everything flows from that. I don't really see it a way in which we move forward in America the way we move towards the getting the job done in Rob Portman style, unless there's a change in the motivations, the incentive structure of those running. For Marjorie Taylor Greene, it is pure win profit politically to be undermining the speaker. She only gains money, she gains more support. And as you said, the very conservative opponents that were lining up against her and others look at that and say, whose voters are going to turn out? The voters, very small number of the extremists, both parties more so on the Republican side, they turn out, they dominate who is nominated. And then you get to the general election and it's just tribal, you know. I'm an R or a D and that's who you vote for and the quality of the candidates. Do you disagree with that?
No, and in an increasingly polarized country, that last step, which is the general election, becomes more problematic because people are kind of lined up. So this is a self-selected group. You have come here in the middle of the day, listen to some guy from Ohio who you really don't care about. How many of you vote in primaries? Raise your hand. How many of you vote in primaries? Okay, well, even here, about 40% of you, 42.3% I saw, didn't raise their hands. I mean, again, this group is more active politically, and that's great. But most people just don't vote in primaries. So you get, to Larry's point, you get 20, 30% of Republicans voting in a primary, 20 or 30% Democrats voting in a primary. And if it's a red district or a blue district, the result is preordained. This is why people say 8% of Americans are electing more than half of the members of Congress. If you think about it, if it's 20 to 30%, it doesn't include independent voters, it doesn't include voters from the other party. So at the end, that distills down to less than 10% of the eligible voters are showing up. Now, in a swing state, which Minnesota may be becoming per Larry, that may be different because you might end up with a really competitive general election. But if general election is not going to be competitive, then again, the incentive structure goes all the way back down to that primary. And the systems to change it are all controversial because this is a tough issue. And those who say it's not, I would ask you to talk to the voters, because people are already distrustful of our electoral system. There's not a high level of trust in institutions generally right now in this country. But on the right and the left, there's concerns about our electoral system. So if you go to a majoritarian system, a ranked choice voting system, or some other, Maine has one, Alaska has one, California has this open primary system, as you know, where you end up usually with two Democrats running against each other in the general election, but one tends to be more moderate and in theory would, attract more Republicans. So maybe some of those systems will end up working well. Some are complicated, particularly ranked choice. People don't understand how those work. And again, we're already looking at a skepticism about our electoral system. So it's got to be done right. It's got to be done in a way that assures people that there's a majoritarian outcome. Anybody follow ranked choice voting? So those of you who haven't, we'll have a seminar on it after the words for 2 or 3 hours to figure it out. No, but if you have, let's say, top 4, some have top 4, some have top 5, I think. So you have an initial vote and you have to rank your choices. And you end up with then 4 or 5 people. And if nobody wins the majority, then you go to the second choice. So you end up in theory with somebody getting nominated in a primary or elected in a general election who is a second choice for a lot of people. And I think that's how Lisa Murkowski got reelected.
Yeah.
She wasn't the first choice, but she was the second choice of the majority. So I don't know if I've explained that well. Have I explained that? Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's complicated. And
but I think one thing that you're pointing out indirectly is that there's a myth about the primaries, which is it's democracy. This is not democratic. This is a tiny, maybe 10, 15% of the electorate is turning out. And then they're making this, really existential choice because come the general election, the D's and the R's in the general election are just going to side up with their team. You look at AOC, she knocked off a prominent leader in the House who was a deal maker. She had 12.5% turnout in that really important primary. And she mobilized the primary base in Queens, and she went on to win. And it's had a dramatic effect. You could tell the same story even more so in the Freedom Caucus in the House, where there's like 2/3 of them were elected by really narrow margins. Jim Jordan, he was, as you know, he was contentious and not a deal maker when he was in the State House. And there are just many of these. So I think this is a key issue, and we agree on that. I want to come back to the bipartisanship, because to me, when I look at bipartisanship, I see temperament for sure. Who are the people willing to take the uncomfortable step to talk about and consider compromise? Not everybody's wired like that, Ted Cruz. But I think it's institutional. And the institutional part is critical. James Madison threw a curse on us. We've got to, go through these steps and hurdles that he deliberately wanted, because he did not want the government to do very much. Then you've got, this situation that's now emerged. We have very tiny majorities, both parties in the House. It empowers the extremist groups, even if they're just a few dozen like that, the Freedom Caucus. It's a difficult environment to try to govern it. You've been talking about some of the institutional changes that you think might help in making bipartisanship possible. One of them is FasTrack, and you've obviously had experience with that through trade legislation. Could you talk a little bit about how FasTrack process would help in Congress, particularly on, let's say, the budget, where there's no doubt our deficit is out of control. Both parties are guilty of that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Just quickly on the primaries, one of the solutions is vote. Vote in primaries. And tell independents, you have an opportunity here to shift the debate and get engaged and involved. But I think you're right on your analysis of the problem. And one thing that the future generation is going to really be upset about is when they find out that it's not $34 trillion, it's $68 trillion, whatever it's going to be by the time they come of age and start paying taxes. We are just out of control in terms of our long-term debt and deficit picture. And that overhang of debt and deficit is, I think, already affecting the economy and interest rates, and it certainly will in the future. So we benefit in America from the fact that we're sort of the cleanest dirty shirt in the closet. Like the rest of the country is not doing, the rest of the world is not doing very well economically either. But the debt and deficit has to be addressed in order for us to have, again, the ability in the future to have a strong and prosperous economy. So how do you do it? It's so difficult to get at the issues on the tax side for Republicans in terms of anything to do with entitlements, which is the word I'm using because that's how they're described in law, but that means Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. If you meet the qualifications, you're entitled. It doesn't go through an annual appropriations process. You automatically get the benefits. That's what it means. But the problem is the country will be bankrupt unless we deal with this issue, particularly as we have, people living longer and healthier lives. And the demographic shifts that have already occurred have created this huge, almost insurmountable $34 trillion. So how do we deal with this? And one way that we have dealt with it in the past is to have a outside commission made up of members of Congress and some experts. I would think mostly members of Congress would be appropriate. And then look at all these issues and report back to Congress and have a fast track authority, as Larry says, to be able to consider the legislation. It could be an up or down vote, as it was with BRAC, the Base Closing Commission. You may remember that. Very hard to close down a base, right? Because the senators, particularly who represent that area, and in the Senate, one senator can stop things forever, don't want to see their base downsized. And yet the military had too many bases and too much expense. And so you had this commission that would look from an objective point of view with experts and then report to Congress, and Congress votes up or down. And it worked. So there is some reason to believe that that's possible. Also, when you look at commissions in the past that have done this, the Greenspan Commission is the one people talk about, 1983. I imagine, Hubert Humphrey followed some of this back in his day. Was he in office still? He was out, 83. Wow, I feel old. Remembering when he was in office. Anyway, the point is, it was the first time we've been able to reform Social Security and to help improve its fiscal outlook ever. So that goes back to 1983. And so the idea is to have a commission that looks at the entire issue, taxes, entitlement, so-called mandatory spending and discretionary spending, and come up with recommendations. Some people are very skeptical that this could ever happen. My answer is, well, we got to try. And if we don't, the alternative is terrible for, again, future generations, but also our economic growth right now, because that overhang makes it very difficult to have an interest rate reduction that we'd all like to see. And it's very difficult for people to have much trust or full faith and credit in the United States fiscal system if we don't fix it. So that's the idea. And it got a little bit of play over the last 6 months, Republicans and Democrats alike. I will say, when President Biden announced that there will be no changes to any of the mandatory spending so-called entitlement programs, and then President Trump echoed that and said there will be no changes in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, kind of put a damper on things. You have, both standard bearers saying we're not going to touch it because politically it's very difficult. But all the more reason to try to take it outside the system and the dysfunction in Congress today. And again, have some experts at least make recommendations to try to move the ball forward. Some would say, well, we tried that with Simpson-Bowles and it didn't work. You remember Senator Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who'd been chief of staff in the White House, a Democrat and a Republican, came together and had a group of experts, some members, and they made a report. The difference is that was never put on a fast track. It was not statutory. In other words, it didn't have the ability to come to Congress for an up or down vote or even an expedited procedure. It was just recommendations that could be ignored, and were. President Obama made a decision not to support it, which obviously hurt prospects. Others, including some Republicans, weighed in against it. However, I would argue that more than half of those recommendations were eventually adopted. Some would say 2/3, but at least half of them were, as Congress went through annual appropriations processes and trying to figure it out. You remember the super committee? I was a member of that. It wasn't very super, but we did come up with a lot of ideas out of Erskine Bowles and Al Simpson's package that later became law. So it did help. And I think that's something that is timely again. And my hope is that we would have done it 6 months ago and then say it will report during the lame duck session after the election in November, so that, we don't know who's going to get elected. We don't know who's going to be in the majority in the House or Senate, but we would have this recommendation out there regardless, and with strong bipartisan support, because you would want probably a supermajority of the commissioners to be able to support it, and then have an up or down process at some point, have an expedited process to review it, and then vote yes or vote no. And if Congress chooses to vote yes or no, the American people know it, and can make their decision accordingly. But at least we would move the ball forward in that sense. And I think that's extraordinary, but I think it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think this is another example about how the process matters. Bipartisanship sounds good for Ted Cruz. Lord knows he needs all the help he can get to rebrand himself. But I think there are these institutional arrangements that we need to wrestle with. Fast track is an example. Reciprocity, which is a political science word for you co-sponsor my legislation, I'm going to co-sponsor your legislation. The Senate, that seems to happen more often. It's a bit of a closed group, but you just see a lot of that going on, and it makes sense because you need to build to 60. And then there's kind of the complexity of legislation can sometimes be an advantage. So the work you did on infrastructure, there are a lot of different policies in this thing we called infrastructure, and you were able to address the concerns of specific senators and states whether it's through highways or rail or water treatment or broadband. And so what looks like a incredibly complex, maybe indigestible piece of legislation becomes a tool in the hands of someone who knows how to work the process.
Yeah, we were given up for dead many times in that process because again, people had tried it over the years, and the sense was, all those issues you talked about, and you're right, it is very complex. It also, it was a lot of money, over $500 billion in new spending over a 5-year period, but it also, it did involve some controversial areas, like public transit, or internet expansion. Fast internet, was something that many of us in states like Ohio felt strongly about. We have a lot of rural areas that don't have it. In other states, it wasn't a big deal. And so, yeah, you had to cobble together this coalition. And again, at many times, the writers who were following it and other members of the media who were looking for controversy said, it's dead. They couldn't agree on this. And, we have an inside scoop that there was controversy in the meeting and that Joe Manchin, threw his shoe at Rob Portman or whatever. I mean, they were all about the controversy. And we'd come out and say, actually, we're doing fine. And we just need a little more time to get there. I was with Manu Raja, some of you know Manu on CNN, who covers Congress now, his own Sunday show. He said, well, Rob, of course we told you it was dead because we always bet on Congress failing, because that's typically what happens. Sort of a sad commentary, but he's probably right. And so that was sort of the news flash that would come up, is that Congress fails again. But we put our head down and again, this attitude of saying, we're going to get there. We're going to get to the solution, no matter what it takes, and no matter how long it takes. And sometimes, we would have long sessions into the night. Start off with 2 of us, then 5 and 5, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and then eventually 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. And in the end, we got 69 or 70 votes for the package by sort of working from the middle out and overcoming a lot of negativity, including President Trump, who opposed it. So, it can be done. It can be done, but it does require, working with colleagues and trusting colleagues.
And knowing the process and the institutions.
Yeah.
I think that's a critical part of this, because it is attitude and temperament, which you've been singled out for, but it's also the process. This is a really cursed process we have in Washington, and you add the polarization, and it makes it even worse. Let me get to some of the questions folks here and online have been giving us, and we've got a lot, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Here's one that'll probably be your favorite. President Trump was impeached for inciting insurrection on January 6th. You voted to acquit. If he had been convicted, and I would add, and there had been a second vote on this, he would not be able to run for president. You and a small handful of Republicans could have saved the Republican Party and the American people from his 2024 candidacy. Do you regret your vote?
No. And it's the same reason I didn't support the impeachment of Mr. Mayorkas last week. I think impeachment should be used in very rare circumstances because it's anti-majoritarian. He's elected. And because the founders, in my view, were very clear about how rare it should be, and specifically, constitutionally, it should not apply to people who have already left office, and it has never been applied that way. And my strong view was, if you get into that, then it will happen again and again. The other side will do the exact same thing. And I think if Alejandro Mayorkas had been convicted in the Senate, and I'm glad he wasn't, I think you would have seen the same thing by Democrats doing it to Republicans, cabinet members. And so it's, the president should get to choose his own cabinet, and ultimately the responsibility should rest with the White House, as it does with regard to border policy. I totally agree that the border is out of control and the policies were bad, but it shouldn't be him. And with regard to President Trump, I mean, with Republicans in the House, I could definitely see the impeachment of President Obama based on his 24 misstatements, let's say, on the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it would just go on and on, tit for tat. And that I feel just the opposite. We need to stop doing that. I also said at the time, by the way, the criminal justice system was the place to have this brought up for a former president, and that's happening. I also, of course, objected strongly to the calls for the election being deemed, inappropriately handled, and so long before January 6th, I was saying President Biden is our next president. He was duly elected, and that night, I insisted on speaking on the floor and talked about this as an assault on democracy. And so, I mean, I think it's important to be clear as to what happened on January 6th, but it's also important for us as a country not to fall into that partisan back and forth.
There are several questions here from students, and I want to get to them. One is a couple questions, and I would say it boils down to something I hear all the time as a professor here. Nothing ever changes. Nothing ever changes. And so the question is, you've worked on environmental legislation, education reform. Both were important. Both were bipartisan. And yet we look back and climate change is spiraling out of control. Racial disparities remain, in some cases, are deepening, including here in Minnesota. So what do you say to students who are just really losing hope that they can get change through elected office and through the lawmaking process?
Well, in all those cases, I do believe we made good incremental progress on a bipartisan basis. It's made a difference. So when you talk about climate change and the environment, I was able to work with Republicans and Democrats to get a bunch of bills passed that are actually helping. One is when I did way back in the House days that they say has saved something like 80 million acres of tropical forests, which is not just important for biodiversity, but also important for the emissions and the number of metric tons of emissions that were saved. I can't remember the number, but it was a very simple prospect, which is telling countries if you save your tropical forests and don't burn them, you get debt relief from your USAID debt or other debt to the United States. And countries have taken advantage of that. They still are. And we're doing deals still with other countries. And we kept it bipartisan. We kept it sort of as a market-oriented approach to how to get to lower emissions. Tropical forest burning or forest burning is number 3 or number 4 in terms of emissions. So yeah, it's incremental, but it's making a difference. So don't give up. Don't give up hope. And then in the infrastructure bill, we had about $100 billion worth of energy initiatives, including more renewable energy and specifically hydrogen hubs around the country that are now being established that are going to make a huge difference. I think the hydrogen economy is pretty exciting. So, I mean, there are things that you can do that are not a home run, but, when you go up to the plate, you don't always hit a home run, but you try to hit a single, you try to hit a double. And that's one concern I have is that sometimes on the right and on the left, we say, I'm against this because it's not good enough, because it's not a home run. And if you look at our history as a country, it's rarely a home run. Medicare may be the exception to that. It's a single, it's a double, and it moves us incrementally forward. So to those students, don't give up. I mean, you have to figure out a way to move the country forward. I will say, in terms of racial disparities on the economic side, there was a period before COVID where you did see the poverty rate at an historic low. You did see unemployment among certain groups who had been marginalized at record low levels. And I think we need to get back to some of those policies and some of those incentives to get the economy moving and working for people who are in the middle income area, lower income area. And it's, I raise it only because it's not impossible for us to see progress there. And we've seen it as recently as, 5 or 6 years ago.
There are a couple questions here about the retirement of moderates and concerned that when the moderates are retiring, they're being replaced by folks who are less interested in deal making and are more ideological. And one of the examples was given by your successor in Ohio, J.D. Vance, who's more of a MAGA style, Trump style Republican. And you've been public in criticizing some of his positions. And what can we do? This is the question here, to incentivize the moderates to stay and defend good government.
Well, elect them. You know, that's I'm supporting candidates around the country who I think are going to be interested in finding common ground. Again, that's my focus. But we talked earlier about voting in primaries. You know, don't just let someone else make your decisions for you. And you know, holding people up. We have an opportunity with our little Portman Center, you know, to do research on primaries, to do other things. One thing we're doing is just literally holding up people who are bipartisan. And, you know, we're going to have a little award every year, and we bring them in as speakers. We've just had Kirsten Sinema come in and open up our center, who was a Democrat, now an independent. She's not running again, unfortunately, so she may be an example of that, but she's a deal maker and works across the aisle to get things done. We wanted to hold her up in that respect. And so I think we need to figure out ways to counter the incentive system, Larry, that you talked about earlier, where the incentives all seem to be going toward moving people out. It's almost like a centrifugal force, you know, fundraising, media, the way primaries work, it just pushes out. And you have this ironic situation where I think Americans increasingly are saying, we want people to get together and figure this out. There's some polling out there showing that, you know, most people agree that you need to compromise and get things done. And yet there seems to be a dichotomy between that growing sense and the political class and the political culture. So it's all of our responsibility to figure that out in terms of voting in primaries, holding people up who are getting things done. And, you know, it's a broader issue, obviously, about America and our divisions in this country and the polarization. But the best of America's tradition, as we started off saying in that first question, is figuring out how to find that common ground. By the way, for me, I was there for 30 years. And as Jane will tell you, you know, it's a family affair. I mean, it's not just me, it's your family. And it's after 30 years of it, I'm really glad to be out for a lot of reasons. But one is that my family, you know, is happy to have me out. Right, family? Here's some family right here. But also, you know, you try to help from the outside, and that's why I'm here today and trying to do this through this Portman Center. And I do think we need to rethink a lot of these issues, fundamental issues like primaries, in order to get to a better position where people are rewarded. And again, I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you need to be moderate to do this. I know some moderate members of the House and Senate who don't do much bipartisan deal making. On the other hand, I know some people who are pretty conservative who are willing to do it. I think about, I don't know, Senator Murphy from Connecticut, Senator Cornyn from Texas, you know, one guy pretty liberal and one guy pretty conservative. And yet they got together on gun safety legislation. And I was one of the people that did that with them, but it was really led by the two of them. So to me, it's more about attitude than it is about ideology. In other words, you can be pretty far to the right and pretty far to the left and realize at the end of the day, you've got to figure out how to find common ground and come up with some solutions. Again, incremental, you would say, yes, the gun safety legislation was incremental, but moving in the right direction. So I don't think it's just moderate. I think we need to, although I know I'm pushing against the grain here, but I think we need to think about more, you know, what's your attitude? Like, are you being elected to be, as some of my colleagues would say, a celebrity? You know, is it performative? Is that what you think politics is about? And I think some members of the younger generation who are coming in seem to believe that politics is about you. It should be about them. It should be about the people you represent and how do you get stuff done for them. And whether you know, are on TV every night throwing out the red meat is really not the issue. It's whether you're getting something done.
We've got several questions from the folks here and then online about the anti-democratic impulse within the Republican Party. Folks point to laws passed in Georgia and Texas with regards to election administration. There's concern about Donald Trump's poll watchers and other facets. How do you look at that? Is this just the kind of usual partisan chatter, the Republicans pointing to things the Democrats are doing, and it's folks who are fundraising and they got an organization going, and it's just political business basically. Or do you see real threats here that what happened in 2020 election was a trial run for what could happen in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of parse it, each individual issue you're talking about. I do think it's important to realize that state legislatures have, under our Constitution, more say than the national level does with regard to elections and how they're run, and that probably is a good thing, but it's frustrating sometimes. And I was involved in the electoral reform efforts, and was one of the, I don't know, five Democrats, five Republicans initially, and it ended up being like 10 and 10 that came up with this idea that, the vice president really just has a ministerial role. So you would avoid what happened in 2020, where there would even be, and to his credit, Mike Pence did the right thing. I was, able to talk to him about it that night, both before and after his appearance in the House chamber, encouraging him because he did the right thing. But it shouldn't even be the role. Why should the vice president be able to step in and change, what the state electors have decided? So we put that into law now, and that was necessary, we thought, because there was so much confusion about it. And we made another number of other changes to try to increase kind of the integrity of elections in people's minds. But I would also ask you, if you're talking about Georgia, for instance, because you mentioned Georgia, what was the other state you mentioned? Texas?
Texas.
I don't know the data from Texas, but look at the Georgia numbers and look at the degree of participation after those legislative efforts were passed. And my understanding is they had higher voter participation in all areas, including among Black voters, than previously. So to a certain extent, this is being whipped up by some people on the right and on the left who are making money on nonprofits that sort of go after this. I'm not saying that, again, every state is perfect. Every state does it a little differently. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about voter IDs because Speaker Johnson talked about it, and people say that's anti-majoritarian and anti-democratic to require an ID. I mean, over 80% of Minnesotans and Americans disagree with that. They think you should have to have an ID when you go to vote. And so those who whip that up, I would, I don't think that's unreasonable. I do think if you don't have an ID, that the state should provide one for free. And not everybody has an ID, unbelievably, because it seems like we have to use them for everything now. So I think it's a little overwrought in that sense. But what happened on January 6th wasn't overwrought. I mean, we can't let that happen again. We can't let the notion that the mob can overturn a duly elected president or member of Congress or senator. So
and it sounds like you think that we've taken steps both in Congress and then around the country to make it harder to pull off a January 6th again.
Yeah, I mean, certainly at the national level, once the electors have made their decision, I think it's really important, as I said at the outset, when we're talking about primaries and election reform, that we all reinforce the notion that elections are fair, honest, open, because there's a lot of skepticism out there, mostly on the right, but also on the left, about our elections and, do they work? And so I mean, election observers should never intimidate people and election workers. Part of our legislation, by the way, was new criminal penalties, I guess, against people who harass or threaten election workers. That can never be acceptable. But to have observers and to be sure that it's fair and to give people a sense that what's happening is fair, I think that could actually be helpful right now. So just acknowledging the mistrust out there and being careful that we don't add to that distrust. I think the primary system needs to be reformed, but we need to be careful how we do it, as an example, so that people don't believe it's anti-majoritarian.
Yeah, I would just add a friendly plug for the program we have here, Certificate in Election Administration. It's the largest program training new folks to go into election administration. It's a pipeline we're trying to build here, and we have about 100 students and it's growing, and it's nonpartisan. It's professional. The people who teach it are
That's great.
who are running elections around the country. Several of them have the FBI on speed dial because they're under threat almost constantly. And in my experience with those people, they're the true patriots because they're taking a stand for democracy and a lot of the values that we've been talking about.
Yeah, Jane and I voted in the primary this year. My candidate didn't win in terms of the Senate primary, but so be it. But you know, I spent most of my time just thanking these poll workers, and they're all continuing to show up. I will say in some states it's harder and harder to find
The
people.
poll workers are part of it. The other part is the professional year-round folks
Mhm.
who are the ones who set up the registration, and
Elections people.
the Board of Elections, the people who do the post-election audits to guarantee that it's a fair election. These people have been fleeing partly because of January 6th. We've seen some real kind of melting of the leadership ranks, which is even more of a problem. Anyway, if you're interested in that, the Certificate in Election Administration, you heard it here.
1-800-Larry.
It's all these things are a team effort, and Lee Chittenden is standing in the back, and she's really a key part of this process. She's the administrative director of our program and has been our hero over the last 10, 12 years. We've been at it for a while. Okay. Rob Portman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
If you can hold on, I just want to make a couple quick announcements as we wrap up here. We've got some great events coming up. Next Monday, April 29th, noon, Anna Greenberg, who's one of the most prominent Democratic consultants and one of the leading consultants for women candidates around the country. She'll be here. She'll be joined by my colleague, Catherine Pearson, who will be moderating that program. May 15th, I'm joined by Vin Weber in our Conservative Voices series. We're excited about that. We have former George W. Bush National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley coming to talk about the threats facing America from China, from Russia, and well, it's that kind. That is May 15th. It'll be right here, noon. If you're interested in this program, it will be available as a video. It'll be out in a day or two. You can find it on YouTube. Just do a search on Rob Portman or our center, and you'll find it right away. Feel free to share that with folks. If you've enjoyed our program or any of our programs, please feel free to make donations. We welcome those. And finally, let me once again thank Rob Portman for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Appreciate it.